Okay, so my name's Andrew Walmsley. I'm currently doing a part-time PhD at Lancaster University, not on Kirkham, by the way, but I do have some connections with Kirkham. My dad actually taught at Carhill High School for quite a long time, from the 60s to the 80s. He died a few years ago, but I think he had very happy memories of working at Carhill. In the past, I've worked for Lancashire County Council with libraries, archives and museums. And most recently, I was a community heritage manager for the Fylde area. So that covered Kirkham. So I did visit the older Kirkham Library quite often. I've been working on the Kirkham Heritage Action Zone project for a while. And as part of that, I wrote a history of a property, which is 29 Poulton Street. So you can see that on the Kirkham Treasures website. So it might be useful for you to visit that at some point, just have a look and see what I've written up about that house. I'll essentially be showing you the sources that I used to write this history, but as it was written during lockdown, they're essentially online sources. But I will refer to material that you might have to go to a library, an archive or elsewhere to access. The presentation sort of presents snapshots of details from these sources, but afterwards I can do some live online searching to give you a bit of a better idea. And I can also base that on some of the questions you might ask. So feel free to put questions in the chat. So these are some of the resources that we'll be looking at. So I look at maps, old maps, electoral registers, trade directories, censuses and other family history records, old newspapers, old photographs, archives, which essentially means Lancashire archives, phone books, deeds, which can actually, if you can get hold of them, would be really useful and important. The 1910 Inland Revenue Survey, and then some other stuff. One piece of advice I would give is when you start this kind of thing is to always record what the information is and where you've got it from, because it's very easy to, especially when you're doing internet searching, you just go from page to page and you forget where you started. So always try and have a trail and have an idea of what you started out as. So this slide, I've just shown you a slide of when I was doing my research. It's usually advised to go backwards from what you know now. I mean, what you can see now goes from 1891 back to 1866. So I was just putting the source, which could be a census record, or Barrett's is a trade directory, for example, and then what I could find. So I was putting it in chronological order, going backwards. And often when I'm talking about history of house, unless you've got a prominent house or you're researching a prominent house, most of the history is going to be made up of the people who live there, the people in the house, as was the case with that section. I always find it quite interesting and useful initially to start with maps. Maps can be just a really useful way of getting an idea of the background of what you're looking at, the area you're looking at. You might not cite the resource in any write-up you might do, but it gives you a good idea of what is there now and what was there before. Some of you may well have used Mario, which is the Lancashire County Council mapping resource. And that's a really useful way of, as in this case, finding a street as it is now. And that gives you the numbers, the house numbers of the street. In this particular case, it's Poulton Street in Kirkham. But also using this, you can swap that map and that location for an older map. So in that case, that's an 1890s map of Kirkham. If I do this live, you can actually slide from the current map to the older map. So you can see Poulton Street as it was then. So a lot of the properties are there, but then you've got land behind it. I think lots of them had gardens or even areas where they might hold animals. And then from there, you can sort of zoom outwards and get sort of broader picture of what Kirkham was like at that particular time. So that's Mario. Another really useful resource is National Library of Scotland has digitised maps for all over the country. So that's an excellent mapping resource, and it's you can view current maps and then look at older maps of different scales. So you can see there I've searched for Kirkham, and you just put a word in the place finder, and it comes up with alternatives. So obviously I've gone for Kirkham filed. And that brings up a current map, but then you can see on the right hand side of there, you've got options to look at other maps. So for example, a map from 1844 to 45, 6 inch to a mile. So if you selected that, that's what you would see. So that's an 1845 map of Kirkham, which is the earliest Ordnance Survey map of the area. So that's maps, really good to get a background or a sense of the geography of an area. Even if you know it quite well, it might surprise you a little bit. Electoral registers I wasn't really able to use in my research. That's just an example of one from the Preston area. So you can see in that case, you're getting surnames, first names, addresses, what the nature of the property is, whether it's a dwelling house or whatever. So you can get a hold of these from the present day back to the 19th century. And I think the filed ones, Kirkham ones, you should probably be able to see in Lancashire Archives and also possibly St Anne's Library for some of the more recent ones. You've got to bear in mind things like who could vote. So obviously in the one you're looking at there for 1868 rather, there's no women on, because women didn't get the vote until 1919, and then it was only women over 21, and then, sorry, women over 30, and then later in the 1920s, it was extended further. The one you're seeing a ward. It's a ward in Preston, and then it's alphabetically within the ward. Usually what you would get with an electoral register is a ward and then streets within the ward. As you're looking for properties rather than people, perhaps, if it's a house history, then that shouldn't be a problem. Usually you'll find some kind of index as well, a street index, which will tell you which ward a particular street was in. But with Kirkham being a relatively small place, it shouldn't present you with too many problems. The second, another really useful resource is trade directories. Again, these are often held in libraries and archives, and you'll find that Kirkham is often included in Preston and District. Now, I couldn't generally get access to these because Archive or Lancashire Archives was closed. But I did discover that the Preston Past and Present Facebook page actually contains lots of digitized trade directories, which includes some that would cover Kirkham. So in this case, you get a Barrett's one for 1882. So it's Directory of Preston, Chorley, Kirkham, Garstang, and all adjacent villages. And within that, often you'll get a street section within a trade directory. It's not generally the case with Kirkham, but as it's quite a small place and you don't get many people, compared with somewhere like Preston, then it's not too much trouble to search through. So you can see here you get a miscellany or a list of names, but then you also get a list by occupation or profession, so which does give addresses. So you could troll through even, and you could see that James Bennett was a painter or a plumber, and he lived at 113 Poulton Street in 1882. So these can be really useful, and one of the most essential things for doing house history. So that's through the Preston Past and Present Facebook page. There are also other things like sometimes on Google Books, you get older books that have been digitized, but this is something called the Hathi Trust, which is an organization of American universities. And they have, in this case, digitized the Directory and Gazetteer of Lancaster, or the Palatine, County Palatine of Lancaster, i.e. Lancashire, for 1824. And you can look at that through their website free of charge. And you will see an entry to Kirkham. So you've got Kirkham with a description of Kirkham. All trade directories have quite useful descriptions of the towns, and that also has a description of the parish. So you see at the bottom there on the left-hand side, it says, Kirkham is a small but handsome and well-built town and may properly be called the metropolis of the Fylde County. So I don't know when any of you ever considered Kirkham to be a metropolis, but they obviously do. And then you get a directory by name, as we've seen before, with a street on. Now you'll see there aren't any street numbers. That's because the houses in Kirkham, as far as I'm aware, weren't numbered until the 1860s, which can cause you some issues if you're trying to trace a property backwards. With this one, I was particularly intrigued to see that I was looking at 29 Poulton Street, and there was various people who were in the coopering profession or kind of barrel making, generally in general terms. And there was a Thomas Island, but in this one, if you can see on the right-hand side, there's a Dorothy Island who's given as a cooper. Now, that intriguing that it was a woman who was there and in the profession, which that suggests. So I don't know exactly what that means, but I was quite intrigued by it. And whether she was some relation to the Thomas Island, who was on Poulton Street as a cooper at number 29 later on. So this obviously raises all kinds of questions, which you don't necessarily get answers to, but you can always leave sort of questions open for research at a later date. The same directory, this lists people by name. So you can, again, you get flower dealers, grocers, ironmongers, etc. I showed this to a school quite recently, and they were obviously they didn't know what a milliner was, so that might be something that puzzles some younger people, hat makers, of course. Now, looking at the two main online sources that you can use are Ancestry and Find My Past. Now, libraries are starting to reopen again. You can obviously pay a subscription to these and use them at home. Blackpool libraries, which you could join, are still, over the period of the pandemic, they were giving free access to Ancestry. So if you became a Blackpool library member, you could use Ancestry free of charge from home. Usually you have to physically be in the library to do this. But Ancestry and Find My Past. If you're going to when Lancashire libraries, well, they are open now. They have kind of reopened. I'm not sure whether they're limiting how much time you can spend in, but you can use Ancestry free of charge within Lancashire libraries on their computers. So there are quite useful records on here. I'm going to mention one that is particularly useful in terms of this, looking at the house going backwards in time, that is, and that is the 1939 England and Wales Register. It serves a similar function to Census Records for researchers, but it isn't a census record in itself. Censuses were records that we have records for from 1841, currently available to 1911, and next year we should get the 1921 one. So that's every 10 years from 1841, giving household information. The 1939 register was compiled at the start of World War II with the aim of providing a record of who lived in each property, so they could produce identity cards at the start of the war. So you can search for this by location. So you can say lived in, as I've done here, lived in Kirkham, and I've put Poulton Street in as a keyword. And then that will give you a list of people who come up in alphabetical order from Poulton Street in Kirkham. Now, if you select one of those, you'll land somewhere on Poulton Street. So on there, I found 29 Poulton Street. Hopefully you can see that. It's a little bit small on my screen because I've got my notes coming up as well. But on 29, you've got Fred Ingham and Sarah Ingham, and also a William and Lily Spencer. You can see that they live at 29. Fred is a second-hand dealer, and Sarah, it says unpaid domestic duties, so she's a housewife. William Spencer is also living there, probably boarding, and he's a labourer or builder. You can extend your search out from there to the individuals. So I looked at William Spencer, and you can see that a William R. Spencer married a Lily Knock in the Blackpool district in January 1938. So I'm assuming that this is him. I'm fairly certain this was him and Lily. And if you sent off to Lancashire Certificate Services, you could then get a hold of their marriage certificate, which would tell you a bit more information about them and their family. Quick drink. Now, moving on to the census records themselves, so these are really useful for going backwards in time, searching a property. You can only search for a street directly on Ancestry on the 1911 and the 1881 censuses, due to the way they've been indexed. So you can see on the left, I've searched for Kirkham, and in the keyword, I've been able to put Poulton Street. And this again produces a list of names, which you can then click on, and they will give you more details of the people involved. So with the 1911 census, you get a separate page for each property. So this was a property on Poulton Street. And I just picked this because the name struck me. Chorlton Dunkerley, which is a name to conjure with, who is a solicitor on Poulton Street. Now, using the arrows on the right and left, you can scroll through. So you can scroll through and get to the next property on Poulton Street. Now, with the 1901 census on Ancestry, you can't search by a street, but what you can do is browse. So you see on the right-hand side where it says browse this collection, you can see Lancashire, Kirkham. And then in this case, I've selected District 9. And on District 9, this is the first page of that district. So if you look down, it will say it includes the north side of Poulton Street. This is on the contents further towards the bottom. Numbers 2 to 112. Also has Burley Street on there and other streets. So that tells you the parameters of that particular district. And then you can search through. So going through using that method, I found I could search through Poulton Street number by number. So you can see this is one particular side and it's the odd numbers at that time. So on that time, you've got Mary at 29, which was the house I was interested in. You've got a Mary Walmsley, who was no relation, and a daughter. And Mary was a confectioner and a dealer, a baker's. Once you've got that information about Mary, so you get information about who she was, where she was from, you can. So I was searching for Mary Walmsley from Clyton near Garstang. You can get a bit more information about where she was before or after the 1901 census. So in 1891, I found that she was at Poulton Street, but her family was a lot bigger. She was a widow. She was a widow on the first one, and she was a widow going back to 1891. But you'll see her son there was Edward, and Edward was a cooper. So it is down as a confectioner's and cooperage. So it's both a confectioner's and a cooperage at that particular time. And you've got her extended family there, so her children are there. Going back to 1881, I found her in Garstang. So she was on the Market Square, I think, or in Garstang. So her husband her husband was called Edward, he was a cooper. And the children were scholars, so the children were all in school there. So they obviously, with that information, you know, the family moved to Kirkham. They took over a place that was perhaps already a cooperage, and also ran a confectioner's. One useful aspect from Ancestry, and I think Find My Past does the same, it gives you suggested records. So when you find an entry on the right-hand side, you often get other suggested possibilities. So you'll see there's a Mary Huthersall listed, and Mary Huthersall did marry an Edward Walmsley in Garstang in 1867. So you're building up a picture of the people who came to live at 29 Bolton Street in this particular case. Find My Past. I don't usually use Find My Past that much myself, but I did sign up for, which is a useful tip actually. You can sign up for 2 weeks free access. You have to give your credit card details. So if you don't want it for more than 2 weeks, make sure you cancel that. Then they don't charge you a subscription. But again, in this case, I searched Kirkham, Lancashire. I put in Bolton Street at the bottom. I also selected the 1871 England and Wales census. So then you would get a list of people who are on Bolton Street. And then once you've selected one of those people, you can select a page and then scroll through from page to page, giving you all the people, in this case, on the odd numbers of Bolton Street. I've found all newspapers can be really useful. You may get a mention of the street or even the people that lived on the street or the property or an advert for the property if it was a shop. If you're a member of Lancashire Libraries, you can use British Library newspapers free of charge from their Lancashire Digital Library. You need to be a library member. That takes you back from the early 19th century to the mid 20th century. There's also something called British Newspaper Archive, which covers, it's essentially the same thing as far as I can see, except that the coverage on British Newspaper Archive is a bit broader. Now you can take out a personal subscription to this, but you know, maybe try the libraries one out first and see how you get on. So an example of one thing I found here was just an advert, 6 Bolton Street, Kirkham. Reed and Sons have received instructions to sell by auction the office furniture, desk, typewriter and partitions. So you know that this is, I think it's a press, yeah. I'll just enlarge that. There's an enlargement of it there. It's the Lancashire Evening Post from 24th of June 1925. So it tells you a bit more, you know, the building was probably an office. So someone was running a business. So Mr. O. Griffiths was probably running a business there at that particular point. Occasionally you might find something else, like in this case, there's someone who died in Wesham. It was an Eleanor Ford. There was in 1911, a Richard Ford was at 29 Bolton Street. He ran a fruit shop. And this Eleanor Ford was his mother. So this is a description of that funeral that took place. So it does mention a Joseph Ford of Bolton Street further down. You might also find, you know, if your relatives or the people who lived in the house have done something particularly disreputable, they might be up in court, or they might have some particular office within the town. So you might find other ways that these people might be mentioned. So that's all newspapers. Old photographs can be very useful. And actually in this case, I've found the Kirkham and Wesham Memories of the Past Facebook page is probably the most useful in terms of properties or the fronts, particularly shops or views down Bolton Street, say. And you can search for, you know, just do a search for Bolton Street or whatever, and it will bring up various options. Or you could do a search for a particular shop or a property or a particular name. You do get quite a good collection of photographs on, this is the Lancashire County Council digitised photograph collection. It's an image archive on Red Rose Collections. So if you just search for Kirkham, obviously it brings up people with the surname Kirkham, but it does bring up photographs relating to Kirkham. And that's a couple of examples. So you've got buildings in the background there. So one's the bottom of, you know, Bolton Street. Some of you may know where the one on the right is. That was Kirkham Club Day around we were guessing around 1920, I think, looking at the dress of the people in the photograph. But some of you may be able to tell me which particular street that was. Collections at Lancashire Archives may prove important for you, and you can search a lot of their collections just using something called Lancat, L-A-N-C-A-T, which is their online catalogue. So you can search through, you can search for Poulton Street, Kirkham, for example, and that would give you 61 records for Poulton Street. It's not that many to search through to get the basic details. I did, when I was doing my search, I think I put the surname Ireland in because one of the people I was looking for was Ireland, and that brought something up for a property on Poulton Street. But you can get examples such as this. So in this case, you know that a Thomas Parkinson of Poulton Street was having pews made for him at Kirkham Church. So this is church records from the Archdeaconry of Richmond. The Archdeaconry of Richmond, I think, was areas above the Ribble, and the Archdeaconry of Chester was areas south of the Ribble. Or in this particular case, there's a lease to a Christopher Wadham, a blacksmith on the south side of Poulton Street in 1783. These are just obviously descriptions of documents, but it might be quite interesting to see the original document. So I think Lancashire Archives would copy that for you for a fee, or you could go in there and see it. I think they will be open again now, but they might have some restrictions about what you need to do. You might need to make a booking. But just give them a call and they would tell you, obviously the situation's changing in terms of access. But check their website or give them a call. They will give you more information about what they can do for you. And this is the Ireland search I did. So it's a Thomas Ireland who, it's a marriage bond. So it's prior to marrying a Mary Shepherd. Thomas Ireland, who was a cooper. He may have been related to the cooper on Poulton Street, to the Thomas Ireland, who was a cooper on Poulton Street, if could be a father or something like that. This is something, an example of something I found in archive collections when I was doing some research for a project to do with Winkley Square in Preston. I think you might be lucky to find anything like this related to Kirkham, but it's always worth looking. So that was a property on Winkley Square in Preston. And this is the case of house history actually having a plan of the property. So you might be lucky to get that, but it's worth bearing in mind. It's the sort of thing you may find. Phone books. I found you can search phone books on Ancestry and you can browse through them. So in this particular case, looking at the right-hand side, you could browse through the Preston Blackpool Southport phone book for 1978. You used to find that libraries would keep copies of, particularly locals. I don't know whether they do it now, but when I worked in local studies at the Harris Library in Preston, we would keep old copies of phone books for family history purposes. I suspect they've all gone now. You can see some on Ancestry. So this is, and I was interested because I knew on 27 to 29 Poulton Street, the co-op was there. So I was browsing through, going backwards to see when it first appeared. So it seems to appear in the 1970s. I think it's Pound Stretcher now or something like that. That's just an enlargement. That's just the page you can see there of the co-op. So it's on 27 Poulton Street. Now I mentioned deeds. Deeds can crop up in local archives. So places like Lancashire Archives may hold deeds to a property. I have my own deeds because I paid for, the mortgage was paid up. And often they might be at a solicitor's or a bank might hold them, but they can give you important information. For instance, the one on the left told me it was referring to 24 Blundell Road. Now, my address isn't 24. I won't give it away, but given that this might be broadcasted. But it showed me the address had changed. So the address wasn't, at the time the property was being built, it was thought it was one address and it changed to another address. I also got a plan of the building plots and who the builder was. And this is just an example of deeds or things relating to deeds. This is relating to the Burley family. So obviously they're quite an important family in relation to Kirkham. You may find something similar for a house on Polton Street, but it's possibly unlikely. I mean, I suppose you could ask if you're doing a property, if you're thinking of researching a property which is a shop, it might be worth asking the people there if they've got access to them or if they could let you have access to them, because they can reveal quite a lot more information. Who's been at the house for over a period of time, who has lived there, or who rented a property. I couldn't use this when I was doing this. There are some relating to Kirkham. The Inland Revenue Survey was a tax that took place in the earlier 20th century. I just found this on the internet as an example. So it's from the City of London. So it shows you what the property was, who lived there, the address, the rateable value, etc. But it can give you more information if you can find those records. Again, it's showing there are some at Lancashire Archives, but the scope of those records, you could ring them up and ask, say you're interested in this particular street on Kirkham, does this appear, or you might want to go in and check for yourself. And finally, this is just a few other things. So I mentioned the poor rate books. The poor rate was a tax that was levied to support people in distress, people who needed support. But it tells you who was paying the rate and what the rate was that they were paying. They have tithe maps at Lancashire Archives, which show you who own the information that comes with tithe map. Shows you what was on a particular section of land, whether it was a property or it was a field or whatever, who owned it and perhaps who was renting it. Manorial records, again, often appear in local record offices. So there might be some records for the Manor of Kirkham that relate to your searches. Wills can be important. They can tell you, what a person who lived at a property, their value of their estate at a particular time, who the extended members of the family were, and so on. You will find some older wills at Lancashire Archives. So going back from 1858, that's when the ecclesiastical authorities had control of probate and wills. So if you're going back before 1858, local archives will often hold the wills. After 1858, probate offices may have them, but there's an index on Ancestry from 1858 to 1995 of probate, so you can search that. It does give you a bit of basic information, but you might want to see the original will.